The EFF had a manifesto that was 270 odd pages long. People didn't care. These expectations, the first 100 days and so on. Sometimes I sit back and I chuckle and I'm like, guys, it's not as carefully planned and worked out as you think. It's a bit messy. How's the GNU? When are we going to see this? I'm like, listen, just forget this year. This stuff that's being baked in now can only change from the 1st of April next year. If we kept up the rhetoric of the election, Parliament would become completely dysfunctional.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm very excited to be joined by MP, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts and leader of Rise Mzansi, Mr. Songezo Zibi. Thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
No, thanks very much, Sizwe. Just call me Songezo.
Fair enough, and welcome. You know, this interview's been requested many times.
Yes.
I wonder what you think now of what happened in the 2024 election. We've had a few months to digest. And what do you make of the earthquake that shook our country in May?
You know, and I'm speaking with hindsight, Sizwe, because when you are in the heat of the election and you kind of trying to win, I think your perception of what's happening is colored by your ambition of what you are trying to do, right? And the rhetoric of the election.
Yeah.
But I would say that the emergence, I would say, of MK or people who feel represented and seen by the MK message, MKP message, is we should have foreseen it, but we didn't. And I think primarily because the actual vehicle itself didn't exist until late. And the reason I'm beginning with MKP is that
You're not joining MK, right?
No, I'm not. So I'm not joining MKP. I get along with MKP MPs, but that's where it ends. The reason I'm starting with MKP is that my sense of what this moment is, we saw some big patterns. One, the number of people who don't believe in democracy anymore, at least in the effectiveness of the democracy we have, has grown.
Absolutely.
First.
Yeah.
The second thing is that those who invest in thoughtful politics lost. So the EFF had a manifesto that was 270 odd pages long. People didn't care, right? The ANC has a tradition of discussion documents and so on, and eventually manifestos. People didn't care, right? We had a manifesto with policy documents. People didn't care, right? And so, and even the DA, while they grew in percentage terms, they lost in absolute numbers, right? And I can go on and on.
Yeah.
The guys who did well, the parties that did well, out of the outperformers were MKP and the Patriotic Alliance. Now, I'm not saying they're not thoughtful, but I think they had the best understanding of the strength of sentiment and feeling and emotion and so on, and nothing else matters. Contradictions? No, who cares about ideological contradictions and ideological discipline? I think they've got that much better than any political party in South Africa. The question is whether they can sustain. But those are the patterns that I picked up with hindsight. And finally, when it comes to Rise, we were significantly affected, by the way, by MKP because we chose to organize in ANC areas because of our general policy outlook and focusing on community organizing and so on. And there were places where we could easily have a meeting of 350, 400 people in KZN. Once MKP started, that came down to like 65 people.
Wow.
And people would say like, I see Louis, you know, but you know that we're going that side because our friends are going there and family and so on. So we could see it. We could see it unfolding.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right before
our eyes. Yeah, we could see it. We could see it.
What do you think of where the ANC finds itself? Because in some ways it's managed to restore itself to the key offices of state, but on the other hand, I mean, to go to 40 or just below is really quite a significant decline.
You know, since there is a natural organic process that's happening to the ANC, which is decline and eventual death. And it's really difficult to arrest decline and reinvent yourself. I'm a very committed reader of the ANC's political discussion documents. I read other political parties too, but the ANC particularly because they're in government. And I can tell you from the Stellenbosch conference onwards, you read every Secretary General's report. Okay, Guedes wasn't so insightful, but you read every Secretary General's report. And the ANC has been really detailed in chronicling its moral and intellectual decline. Right? I can even quote some sections verbatim. The 2010 NGC had moved from the previous conference having, I think, about 8 or 9 sort of counter-revolutionary or foreign tendencies to like having 11, and some of them had 4 or 5 sub-tendencies within.
Yeah, how many tendencies
Right.
are there?
So you don't get a more detailed diagnosis. And I believe that the ANC does not appreciate the depth and speed of its decline. And unless it tries something drastically different to what I witness, it's going to continue declining through 2029.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because we had this massive decline, but then the ANC managed to, in some ways, reconsolidate at least power. So it sits with a diminished electoral base, but actually when you look at how much power it lost, it did quite well, I would say. To resurrect itself in KZN from 17% was quite a feat.
Yeah.
It governs Gauteng as a minority government, and of course, President, Deputy Speaker, and some key ministries. So we sit in an interesting time where it seems like South Africans have moved away from the incumbent party, but it still has quite a lot of power.
Yes, also because I think one of the things we must appreciate is that there is the ANC as a party, then there is what I regard as ANCism in society. And I often make the example of women's guild members from the Methodist Church or whatever. And I tell people the black skirt they wear on Thursday or Sunday is the same one they wear with a green thing. When they go to ANC meetings. The ANC has been in power and understands statecraft and the tools of power better than any political party in South Africa by mere effect of its incumbency.
Sure.
And I also think that it is somewhat the right thing that the ANC remains there, because removing the ANC suddenly from the levers of power might create a vacuum, in the sense that the other political parties simply don't have the wherewithal to run the institutions themselves. So I think they kind of outwitted the DA, to be honest with you.
I agree.
They've seen things that others have not seen before. I mean, the DA will learn, and all of us will learn from this experience and be better next time as the ANC declines. But it did outwit the DA. And I think that's one of the things that annoys, the chair of the Federal Council, is realizing after the fact that, but these guys outwitted us. They've ended up with more cabinet positions. What I could see before, though, was that once the DA agrees to form a government, the ANC would have a much freer hand to do what it wants to do. Because if the DA doesn't like the arrangement, it would then need to convince MKP and the EFF and other political parties to a vote of no confidence to remove the current president. And then we have which is not going to happen. And I assumed the ANC knows this. So as soon as I got over that hurdle, well, if you want to leave at some point, they might say, well, fine, we'll have a minority government.
And this is the difficult thing for the DA, I think, is that the ANC has figured out that they actually don't necessarily need them. So whatever that coalition agreement in its early stages said, the DA could walk, and the ANC could even bring in new partners if they
yeah.
wanted to stabilize the government further.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they could. I think what the ANC is trying to manage, on the other hand, are those elements within who might then be inclined to push it in a direction that maybe it doesn't want, if they do, because it creates new vulnerabilities as well. There is a vulnerability that comes with being so close to the DA, co-governing with the DA on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is a vulnerability to being like at 50.1%, because stranger things have happened. That arrangement could collapse. To swing to a minority position is not as difficult as coming down from 60-something odd.
You were involved in the negotiations which brought about this coalition. What can you tell us about them that you are able to share that maybe South Africans don't know, just reading the headlines and the news? And did anything about the negotiation process surprise you, disappoint you, give you hope?
No, I mean, I wouldn't use terms like surprise and disappoint, but I would say a confirmation of certain things and maybe some new discoveries, basically, out of the process. The first is that I realized, shame, the ANC was still going through the phases of grief. So there were those who had accepted what had happened and were kind of in the conversation about how do we construct a new future.
Right.
In a sense, I've got a sense that part of what it wanted to do was to give itself a few years to figure things out.
Oh, interesting.
To figure things out, because the defeat for most people, especially in the ANC, had not been expected, to this extent. So there was a shock in the system. So I could see it. And the people, fortunately, that we were speaking to, and I mean, it's no secret, it was in our group, it was Fikile Mbalula, Enoch Godongwana, David Makura. There was Paxter at some point in the initial meeting, and so on, right? They seemed to have kind of accepted what's going on. But there were also other senior people in the organization who were like, no, we can't go with the DA, we can't do this, can't do it. I was like, Chief, you're not in a position to say absolutely can't. You haven't won now. So that was the one thing that I picked up.
Interesting.
The second thing that I picked up, was that there is also a weakness in South African politics. And I saw that in the DA, in the manner in which it dealt with the ANC, which is, so let me give an example. I understood that among others, the DA wanted the trade and industry portfolio.
Right.
Okay, that's the portfolio that oversees black economic empowerment.
Yeah.
Politically, it's a no-no for the ANC if I put myself in their shoes.
Sure.
It's a no-no. And I think if I was in the DA negotiating team, it's important to understand what your opponent is dealing with and where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with them. So that you are able to manage the negotiations in a way that gets you to an outcome. And I felt that was missing in the negotiations. The third thing, at least where specifically we were concerned, is I asked, so why do you guys want us in this thing? Because they approached us, right? So the phases of discussion where we said, okay, first we need to have parliament, a speaker, a deputy speaker, and a president. That's what we need to do first. We're not going to talk about anything else. Let's get over that hurdle because there are budget votes waiting to be processed. So let's do that. Then we got into the phase of negotiation and we said we don't make executive positions a condition. And that was because it's a risky proposition. You end up being a deputy minister to a really useless minister. So we thought parliament is a much safer space. You've got greater independence in the parliament sense, and so we'll make our contribution in parliament. And they were somewhat surprised. I won't say who said this, but they were like, "You guys are too soft," because the other political parties were demanding, executive roles. And I think that the ANC didn't have the what then and what then, and what then. So it took a while for things to coordinate here in Parliament, for instance. It took a while for the leaders of the political parties to actually meet in one room and so on. So even now, there's still a process of figuring out. So these expectations, the first 100 days and so on, sometimes I sit back and I chuckle and I'm like, guys, it's not as carefully planned and worked out as you think. It's a bit messy, like people are working through the fog.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for South Africans to know because it's new territory.
Yeah,
for everybody.
Absolutely.
Right? And it gets frustrating sometimes.
Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below.
Why didn't you want to take a role in the executive? Because I'm sure that would have been available. And what was the thinking behind not doing that? Because it actually requires some self-control as well to say, power's in front of me, but for now, that's not the best option to take.
So one of the things we had to calculate was the extent to which we could be subsumed into the broader government. So we only have 2 MPs in Parliament. A minister is an MP. What happens is once you only have 1 MP in Parliament, it's really difficult to kind of get around and participate in all the things. So 2 is better than 1, first of all.
Sure.
The second thing is you don't know what role the president will assign you. So, you could end up being minister of some such. I don't want to undermine anybody, so I won't. Or you end up being a deputy minister. So you now have a deputy minister who can't even call a press conference on their own. You have 1 MP in Parliament. Nobody sees you. Come the next election, you've disappeared. If you're in Parliament, you've got much better independence to drive issues, to hold your own colleagues in the GNU to account and so on. And I think the Standing Committee on Public Accounts role has been kind of a validation of that strategy and that approach. Otherwise, I probably would be, somewhere in the system where nobody can see.
No, it's a crucial role, and I do want to get on to the work at SCOPA because it's such a crucial cog in the accountability machine. In terms of the GNU, one thing that worries me a bit is that we haven't yet seen a public document which actually tells us how this coalition is working. Maybe you were wise to be inside but also outside, because I don't think people blame Rise Mzansi for that. But it is getting a bit worrying that we don't know, let alone a policy agenda, which seems a distant dream at this point. We don't actually even know how this government is making decisions, and the public can't see that.
So, and you actually make a really good point, Sizwe, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that if people thought this was kind of carefully thought out with steps about what's next and so on, not so. Not in my experience. And your question demonstrates aptly what I was saying earlier on, right? But that said, I think the fact that there is a process of figuring out is important. So we kind of need to provide some space for that, right? So that's important. But I will also say that in this phase, the work that is being done is the work of the 6th administration because of how the law works. So when Parliament opened, the budget votes that were being processed were the budget votes of the previous ministers. And the appropriations that are being done are the appropriations of the previous ministers. So it's kind of not possible to change mid-flight and say, I'm changing this appropriation to that and so on. Plus, the medium-term budget policy statement, which is the three to 5 year outlook, was also codified into an act of parliament, right? In that the finance minister tables the amended appropriations and so on. So your room to do something different is very limited, right? So even the DA ministers are continuing the work of previous ministers, fundamentally. That's just how the law is, right?
Yeah.
There are departments or ministries which did not exist. Those ministries don't have budgets. Because remember, there was Department of Public Enterprises. That's what was appropriated. So if you go to the budget votes post-election, there was a budget vote on public enterprises.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
That's how the constitution works. So the time that we really should look at is that document, at least at the level of government, is going to the medium-term strategic framework, as it was called, and then the budget and so on. Now, that's where we're going to see whether there is a difference in the coherence in approach from a policy and priorities perspective between the previous administration and this one. So it needs a bit of patience, but I felt I kind of need to explain how the system works. So even whatever people want to do, even the ANC ministers in their own portfolios, they still can't reflect yet what the ANC wanted to do in its manifesto.
So when do you expect that change to start taking effect and the legacy policies to slowly recede?
So that begins next year with the next budget. So it begins with the State of the Nation address, with the next budget, and the next round of budget votes. That's when you're able to draw the comparisons between the 6th administration and the 7th administration. So that's when the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
It's also why Parliament's own strategy session about how to oversee the executive only happens next year after SONA, because the new priorities aren't on the table yet.
Wow.
So you can't decide what exactly you're going to oversee, because what you're dealing with is old stuff.
That actually sets up 2025 as a very interesting year where we will actually see the real policy debates coming to the fore, and the government will have to, of course, decide where it wants to go. Goodness only knows what will happen there.
Yeah. So in fact, I've told people since, because I get asked by journalists a lot, so how's the GNU? When are we going to see this? I'm like, listen, just forget this year. Forget this year. I mean, there is very little the ministers can do, or, this stuff that's being baked in now can only change from the 1st of April next year. Right, when the new budgets in terms of new appropriations and so on happen. This period between the medium-term budget policy statement and SONA is the most crucial time, because that is when you are going to see the policy differences and whether the DA or any other political party might decide I want to stay or not. Because what is not funded, whatever the rhetoric is not a priority.
Absolutely. Yeah. This Rise Mzansi obviously has representation at the table of the clearinghouse. To what extent can you share with us how that's working so far? I know it's very early days.
Yeah. So it's had a couple of meetings. So it's also a newly constituted structure. It's dealing primarily with the Bella issue, which must be resolved before the end of this side of Christmas. Basically. It has not gone to the extent of setting out the longer agenda. What's good about it for now is that there is an established rhythm of meetings. The parties have permanent representatives therein, so there is beginning to be a bit of continuity and so on. So the focus for now has been on ironing out the most kind of prominent points of difference, for the reason I've just explained. Which is, if you don't iron this out, it then plays out politically from January on and affects the budgets, who votes for the budget votes, and that kind of thing. So those issues need to be dealt with. And I think it's correct that we do that now. But what we haven't yet done is to move to a longer term program. That's not to say cabinet isn't having those discussions, but at least at the level of political parties, we haven't done that yet. And we're also going to have another meeting of political, leaders soon.
You were quoted in News 24 basically asking the ANC and DA to exercise a bit more maturity. Can you expand on that and some of the misgivings you have about just the way that communication is happening in public?
So, secrecy or confidentiality, let me put it like that. Confidentiality is very important when you're dealing with sensitive topics. Because in the conversation, you may share with me internal dynamics in your own political organizations, which are not public, right? But you're trying to explain that this is why I can't agree to this, because there has to be a level of trust between negotiators. And it's important to hold that confidence. Because if you go and you talk about it outside and you talk about it in a particular tone and so on, you make it difficult for your negotiating partner to have leverage with their own colleagues. Because now, instead of 10 people who understand the issue, 160 people are upset, and it delays the negotiations and so on. So, and what we've seen from the ANC and the DA is a tendency to talk about what they were discussing, and Fikile can't read, and the DA is the most whatever party, and if they want to go, they can go. You're either trying to build a working relationship or you're not. Part of it is that you can scream at one another behind closed doors, but just try and keep the differences manageable in public. And I think it demonstrates a lack of maturity for me, specifically in relation to the nature of the moment and the arrangement that we're dealing with. And I think they kind of need to cool it.
Let's come on to SCOPA, because this is, some would say, the most important place where Parliament is able to hold government accountable, and to have an opposition leader chairing that standing committee means that the party levers, can't be pulled to prevent accountability. What was it like when you got into that role, and has it met your expectations or confounded them?
Let me first talk about the process of election, and I'll be quick.
Sure, please.
So people thought it was an easy arrangement where, in terms of the GNU negotiations, we got SCOPA and we only secured the votes the afternoon before the vote.
Wow, okay.
The ANC had nominated me for the Standing Committee on Appropriations.
Right.
And there was back and forth, I can talk about it because we weren't fighting as such.
Yeah, sure.
But we spoke to the ANC, we spoke to the DA, we spoke to MKP, we spoke to the EFF, right? And we spoke to the other political parties, because we still need to count the votes.
Yeah.
And at lunchtime, the day before, we still didn't have the votes.
Wow. Okay.
For SCOPA, but there was lots of discussion with the chief whip of the ANC, with people at Lutuli House and so on, and eventually, I think by around 5-6 p.m., Fikile called me and said, "Okay, sharp, it's a go." But it was a lot. There were quite a few people that got involved in the conversation. MKP in the voting session chose not to object to my election. So they didn't vote for me, but they chose not to object.
Right.
The EFF objected on principle, and they made it clear that we're not objecting to the person, we're just objecting to the fact that you're part of the GNU and we're not comfortable. And I completely accept that, right? So we got to the election, and I was elected unopposed, right, in that way, because the ANC has got 4, the DA has 2, and the committee has 11 members. So that was a majority with 2 abstaining and so on.
Right.
Then the work itself. Since the work is vast, and I underestimated it. So when I had a meeting with the committee staff, they explained that every entity that has to comply with the PFMA falls under the responsibility of SCOPA.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, so how many is that? They said it's a couple of hundred. It's all the government departments.
Yeah.
It's all the agencies that fall there in at national level. It's all the provincial sort of expenditure.
Yeah.
It's all the agencies at provincial level. It's all the SOCs and so on. And the way Parliament works is that we also have to comment on the annual financial statements of each one. So I now wanted to call Du back and say, listen,
Can you please object?
can we like have a new conversation? But it's been good in the sense that I really have tremendous support from all the political parties, everybody, I mean, MKP, EFF, the ANC, the DA, they all keen to protect the sort of the culture of SCOPA, which is we work together, we're collegial. We can throw barbs at each other elsewhere, but we don't do it here. In SCOPA, we try and deal with the issues. And I think that's becoming well established now.
And what is SCOPA's role from your perspective, and why is it important?
So I will explain it this way, Sizwe. So SCOPA is the audit committee of the government. Let me put it differently. The Auditor General's primary client is the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Right.
That is why in our government system, the Auditor General has to present his or her audit findings to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, because it demonstrates how in the previous 3 years, because it's always the audit is seen on a 3-year cycle, it focuses on 1 year, but things evolve over years.
Right.
They present it to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. And it becomes the Standing Committee on Public Accounts that then liaises with the other committees, appropriations and so on. For instance, we might say, for this piece of expenditure, the funds should be withheld from this department because they haven't properly accounted for how they're using those funds and so on. It's a chronic issue. It goes back 3 years and that sort of thing. Even now, there are going to be some deviations in January that we will be asked to say whether they should go ahead or not. So that's the role of SCOPA in general. That includes chasing after bad guys when it becomes apparent out of the reports.
Yeah. Are you worried that bad guys might exert pressure on you? Because I think most people in South Africa, whether they voted for Rise Mzansi or not, are quite confident that you're a person of integrity. And that's not always a safe place to be in South Africa.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there are two levels at which I need to be careful, and it's true of the other members of the committee as well. The first is that we are not unduly influenced, even subtly. So I have to be careful about kind of people who weren't previously friendly who become overly friendly. You start thinking,
Wait a second.
I wonder what could be coming, what could be coming down the line. So I have to manage my professional and personal relationships really carefully so that we don't have a conflict later on. So that is the first thing. The second thing is the possibility that people will get upset with me and the committee, and I can assure you, given what we are seeing, that will most certainly arise. That will most certainly arise.
Absolutely. Well, it'll be fun to watch as the committee continues. I know you've already had some interesting meetings, shall we say.
Yeah.
And we'll certainly be watching as it unfolds. In terms of Rise, talk us through the idea behind forming Rise, and also where the election has placed Rise, where to from here, because this is quite a crucial moment in South African politics for so many different parties. Rise is no exception.
Yes. So I think the idea behind forming Rise, and it evolved out of like many disparate conversations. Some of the people involved in those conversations are not even in Rise, right? But it became clear, let me say 3-4 years ago, that there has to be an alternative. And a sort of a social democratic alternative in South Africa, because of my continuing belief that the ANC is in decline, right? And in the absence of, if we don't carefully think about what sort of ideas and politics replaces the politics of the ANC that clearly is losing currency over time in South Africa, what then do we do? And I think that project is important within and outside rice. It's really important. So there are many of these disparate conversations, and we eventually kind of coalesced around the idea of forming a political organization. Some of the people that I see now at Rice, I will be watching old videos. What, were you in that meeting? Right? Yeah. I mean, to give a sense, I mean, right in the beginning, Bongani from Shiluva was in the conversation.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Bongani was in the conversation, right?
Yeah.
In the end, he kind of left before and joined Action SA, but he was in the conversation because we all talk and we know each other and that sort of thing. So we've learned some lessons from the election. I'll just mention 3 quickly. 1, we were too queasy unnecessarily about the fact that a lot of our support initially will come from professionals in the middle class. It was with the benefit of hindsight where you're like, hey, wait a minute. Oliver Tambo was a lawyer, Madiba was a lawyer, Walter Sisulu was an estate agent, and, you know, like, but this is how these form. Like, globally, it's like...
Yeah, in South Africa,
Robert Sobukwe was
literally everyone.
Everybody was. This is the responsibility of people society educates. It's not just to line your pockets. It's to also imagine where society. So we're unnecessarily queasy about it, and we didn't campaign as we should have in the suburbs. We genuinely didn't, and a lot of people were like, "Yeah, we've heard about them, but we're not quite sure what they're about." And I think we lost.
That's such an interesting point just to reflect on it, because there's almost a culture in South Africa which comes from our long history with the ANC that you're only a legitimate force if you are a working class force which speaks in working class language.
Yes.
And the country has changed.
Yeah.
The working class itself has changed, and there are many legitimate ways to appeal to the electorate.
In fact, Sizwe, we had these discussions. I felt, and I continue to feel, that in order for the very same middle class to see you as legitimate, they want to see that you have working class credentials.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So that becomes the stamp of approval. So when they say we don't see you on the ground is not them in Bryanston. The ground is the other poor blacks elsewhere. That's what they mean. They might deny it, but that's what they mean when they say we don't see you on the ground, right? And they was, oh yeah, but you're only in the suburbs. Says somebody in polished English who is in the suburbs themselves. So you are correct. So that was the one lesson. I spoke up about the choice of where we campaign and that sort of thing. As we move forward, we need more members of the party that are from student politics, that are from civil society organizations, that are actually professionals, because that's where you get the heft to have ideas and institutional building capacity and so on at all levels of the organization. That's actually what the ANC built. That's what the DA has built. That's what the EFF has done. So we need to invest in that. Lastly, we're going to focus a lot more on urban areas. Because as a new organization, we can't be everywhere. That was a mistake. We're going to focus on urban areas, particularly the metros, and build out from there.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it.
Just lastly, I'm interested in what it's been like to become an MP. And as someone who covers Parliament sometimes, it's fascinating to me how different Parliament is when you see it, even just as an observer from the inside compared to the outside. Everyone knows each other, from the most radical MP to the most radical Freedom Front Plus. People talk. Take us behind the scenes of Parliament and what it's actually like there, because we see the committee meetings
Yes.
and the performance, but what is Parliament actually like behind the scenes? And I don't know if there's anything you saw where you're like, wow,
I'm still learning, and I'll
Yeah.
share some of those. So
Sure.
the first is that I realized we're all government workers. We're all government workers. We're employed by the South African people. We get paid to do a job. Parliament is the board of directors of the whole of South Africa, and we belong in subcommittees which are supposed to do the work and report. Sometimes I see on social media, and your show is really kind of big on digital platforms. People say, they think we hate each other. We don't. I have had some heated exchanges with Brian Molefe on radio previously when I was an editor. We talk.
wow, yeah.
You can't be fighting with your co-worker unnecessarily.
Yeah.
We're co-workers. You know what I mean? So that's the one thing that's important for South Africans to know.
Yeah.
If we kept up the rhetoric of the election, Parliament would become completely dysfunctional. And it couldn't work. Right. So I've learned that protecting that collegial atmosphere is really important.
Yeah.
The second thing is that Parliament can be very inefficient and frustrating. Can be very efficient and frustrating at the same time. You know, Sizwe, Madam Speaker walks in at 30 seconds before 2 p.m. They carry the mace and that gentleman says, Madam Speaker. She sits down, moment of silence, which is like 2.5 seconds. We sit down, she opens the thing and she gets going. I don't know why politicians continue to be late outside of that environment. So I'm seeing all of these contradictions where I'm like, and you get allocated time.
Wow.
Your time is 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Whether you finished or not, Madam Speaker says, that's it, Honorable Mpofu-Walsh, gone. Right. You know, so there is that.
Yeah.
There are some frustrating bits about Parliament, which is MPs, I feel, in fact, let me not say MPs, Parliament contradicts itself all the time. MPs will vote for a budget which is insufficient, let's say, for, Transnet or ESCOM to do its work. And then 3 months later, people go on oversight and they shout at ESCOM executives about why you're not doing X, Y, Z. And I think, okay, but you all voted for them not to get money. A couple of weeks ago. Why are we having this conversation over here? And I think that still needs to connect. And one of the things I'm going to do in the work of the committee is to always end up at performance versus budget, whether the budget allocation was sufficient and whether this failure to meet targets had to do with the fact that Parliament had appropriated little money for this purpose. And if we want the target to be met, we need to provide the money. If we don't, change the target so that we don't shout and humiliate public servants for things that are beyond their control when we make the decisions here.
What's the biggest difference between working in media and working in politics? Asking for a friend.
No, so that the politics and working in the media, at least being an editor, is actually pretty much the same as being a member of Parliament. And I think, and I hear people saying, yeah, but they want to be politicians. I think you are moved by the same thing. For me, when I became a journalist and I joined Business Day, I wanted to make a difference. It wasn't a hobby for me. I wanted to make a difference by highlighting certain things that are happening in society, helping to change perspectives, bring new voices into the media space, Dr. Nomalanga Mkhize, Wandile Sihlobo, Kanti Pai, and that sort of thing, so that you mix up the ideas that are in certain spaces, right? Parliament for me is pretty much the same. We can choose to only have committee meetings in Parliament only, or have some public meetings and bring people on. I can choose to just do committee work or do what I do, which is after every meeting, I shoot a video for Twitter, I explain what we are doing, why we're doing it, where people can find this information and that kind of thing. It's also about communicating to build trust between the people and the democracy, for me. And finally, it's about always taking the bigger picture. And I think journalists must always take the bigger picture. There's a theater, but your job in journalism is also to take a step back and say, what does this all mean? Rather than what's happening. In Parliament, again, we have to say, what does this all mean for the future, for the people, and what kind of decisions we take?
Well, Mr. Songezo Zibi, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We have delivered by bringing you here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Likewise, and I hope it's not the last time.
No, it won't be.
Thank you. Like, share, subscribe. Help us get to 200,000 subscribers as our next milestone. And comment down below. Keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.